You're listening to audio from the Decidedly podcast. For more information, find us on Instagram at Decidedly Podcast.
So you ever done drugs?
No.
I knew the answer. I just wanted to hear your strong rebuke.
Not as a, never growing up. I'm going to amend my answer. So never growing up. I've never done illegal drugs. Let's put it that way. All right. Because like, is alcohol a drug? Is it? But never growing up, I never smoked a cigarette, never did pot, any of that. I have. Now, this is legal, so I'm not violating anything. When I was in California, it's legal there. Recreational marijuana is legal, and so I did try some of that a few years ago. But
it was legal. Like a brownie or what?
No, one of the what you call them, the pre-rolled.
Oh, you did a joint?
The pre-rolled.
Oh, that's actually new information for me.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
Yeah. So bought one at a dispensary, right? Just to see, because I had never done it as growing up in high school, college. I only saw it once. I just didn't hang around people who did. I was athlete, and we just kind of didn't. At least I didn't do it. I'm sure there were people who did at my school, but I just didn't see them.
It's interesting to me. Obviously, growing up, you drilled that into me really young to not do drugs, and that's a good message.
I think that's a positive.
Nobody's got any problem with that message. But I suspect, I'm not a parent, but I suspect as a parent, you are forced sometimes to take hardline positions that have no nuance in them. So the message.
Well, I think you have to as a parent. Otherwise, kids see an opening in the door, and they'll exploit it.
Yeah.
Right.
So
you say, well, you can do this kind of drug, but you can't do that kind of drug.
In this type of circumstance,
I don't think teenagers have that kind of mental ability to screen that out.
Yeah. Well, I was definitely led to believe that I would die and go to hell if I even saw marijuana.
I didn't say that to you.
Yeah, you might as well.
No, I didn't. I didn't say that to you.
Might as well have.
Oh, really? What was I just said don't do it.
Well, you didn't say don't do it because it's illegal, because a 16-year-old doesn't care that something's illegal, right?
What did I say was the rationale for not doing it?
Don't do it because it's stupid and rots your brain, and only loser, evil, awful, dork people do it.
Okay. All right.
Right. So
was that effective?
Okay. Well, it's more.
You want to reveal now? Some years later, was that effective?
It didn't land like you thought it would. But that's not my point.
Okay.
My point is it's more effective than just telling a kid it's illegal.
Well, what would have been effective? I mean, so you can't say it's illegal. I'm certainly not going to say don't do it because I said so, which I think is the lamest of all parenting tactics. No. But if I can couch it as, hey, people, it does negatively impact your brain at that age when you're still developing.
That's
so
true.
That's
but that nuance is wasn't in the conversation. It wasn't like, don't do it now.
Well, I'm not going to do that. That's not good. Do it later. Do it when you're 40, man. Yeah, well, just wait. It'll be fine. Just hold on. It'll be good later. I didn't say that either.
Well, what I think is interesting is that kind of, I would have never imagined that even if it was legal that you would ever even consider it, as a kid.
I've still never smoked a cigarette.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Never. No. We had, my dad drilled that into my brain when I was growing up, because my grandparents on my dad's side both smoked pretty aggressively. And I remember going over there as a kid and just having these sort of negative physical reactions, just asthma, just not being able to breathe, coming back and smelling like cigarettes. Both of them passed away in their 50s. And as a result, I mean, my grandmother came and lived with us for, briefly, and was in pretty ill health. And so I didn't need anybody to tell me not to smoke cigarettes.
Yeah.
But and so I guess I carried that over to marijuana and didn't really see it much. So I wouldn't even know who to.
Well, I don't think that you were alone in that, right? And it seems that as a country, as a society, that was the position. Hey, it's illegal. Boom, can't do it. It's terrible.
No, that's
and
changing.
It's just as bad as anything else. And I think that's prevented. That's carried over to other drugs, and some of them, rightfully, nobody's out there advocating meth. Nobody's promoting that as a healthy therapeutic. But there's a lot of new information in science that certain psychedelics in some ways can be beneficial. And I think that it's interesting to see how that gets adopted and received, because most people react reflexively, just like you taught me to, is to say, hey, you know what, this is bad and there's really no benefit. So even if we're presented with information, with science, or even testimonials to the contrary, it's hard to accept. It's hard to accept, and it's hard to change a belief that we've held for so long.
Well, I think gradually, societal attitudes on marijuana, for example, are changing dramatically over the next 10 years. And it may very well be with psychedelics that those eventually change as well. I don't know. I mean, they frighten me because I wouldn't want a negative experience. And so sometimes I hear about people that have negative experiences. I don't know. I wouldn't want that.
I think that you really like to be in control of the decisions that you make.
Yes.
And most people do. That's a good place to be. It's not good to have a lack of control of those decisions, but those substances represent an opportunity to lose control over that decision-making process.
Yeah, I think that's what frightens me.
Yeah, I think that's pretty normal. I think it's people who aren't afraid of that don't make good decisions.
Well, it's probably not a good decision to feel comfortable being out of control of the decision-making process.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You would only feel comfortable lacking control over your own decision-making process if the version of you who is in control makes bad decisions anyway.
Right.
You go, well, how much worse could it get? I'm already screwing this up.
It's true.
It's true. So I think that's really normal. But I was surprised to hear from our guest today, Rick Andstrom.
That took a turn.
You've always got something to say on my segues. I think this was a good one. This was not a bad, but we talked to Rick, and he's a Navy SEAL, and he had a pretty significant experience positively with psychedelics. And we weren't expecting it when we scheduled this, and we weren't expecting it when we talked to him. But that's where the conversation turned, and we were still able to gain decision-making insights from that. And it was fascinating. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean when it took a turn. I was expecting to talk to Rick about all kinds of Navy SEAL experiences, and we went to a place I did not think we were going. Yeah. It was fascinating.
Well, Rick Andstrom is a highly decorated 25-year Navy SEAL. He deployed 8 times as a SEAL medic, intelligence team leader, intelligence operative, and trained over 200 operators as a SEAL instructor. Rick was awarded over 40 decorations, including the Bronze Star, multiple combat action ribbons, and Sailor of the Year. He's conducted over 50 combat missions as a SEAL medic in Iraq and Afghanistan. Also has led or conducted over 100 sensitive intelligence operations in dozens of countries. And today, he spends much of his time advocating to reduce the stigmas associated with trauma and promoting psychedelic therapies to treat mental health and neurological conditions like PTSD and TBI. Hope you learned something from listening to our conversation that we had with Rick Andstrom. I'm Sanger Smith with Sean Smith. This is Decidedly. Hey Rick, I'm really excited. You're solidly in second place for the toughest guest we've had on this podcast.
Well, who was first?
Second? Wait, what was? What was the first?
My grandma.
Exactly.
Oh,
Yep, I believe it.
So I'm sorry I couldn't give you the gold medal on this one, but I think
Hey, no worries, I get
you're silver all alone to yourself.
I was reading your bio, and holy cow, man, you've lived a life.
It's been interesting. I feel like it's been a blessed life, and it's had its ups and downs, and it's only time to get continue to get better, and just keep moving.
I can't wait to hear more about it. When did you go through BUD/S?
Well, that's a big part of the story. So my first time I went through in 1989. My second time I went through in 1995 or 96, and then I finally graduated in 1998. Kind of what led me to take 3 times, and what I actually figured out along the journey is I think it kind of resonates with people, so it might be interesting.
That seems like a similar story to a lot of the really hardcore guys out there, like David Goggins going through it 3 times as well. That's
Yep.
I can only imagine going through it 1 minute of one day, much less going through it 3 times.
Yeah, it sucks. I mean, I wouldn't say there's a whole lot of fun about it. At any time you go through it, it's hard to imagine beforehand the amount of pain and suffering that your mind can put you through. And that's kind of the part I figured out.
Yeah, what happened that caused you to have to go through 3 times?
I think, it was a lack of mental toughness. I never rang the bell. And that's what a lot of people, when they say, hey, I can't have this, I can't take it anymore, they ring the bell. I had stress fractures the first time. I had, tendinitis different in my knees. And I went to medical, and I finally got washed out and rolled out. And it wasn't until before my third and final time that I was like, you know what, nothing changes if nothing changes. I can't expect to just roll on through here if I don't make some positive steps to do something about it. And I had a pretty good deal. I was working on a small island outside of San Diego called San Clemente Island, where it's pretty isolated. And I had a lot of time. I was working as an EMT, and I came across a book, and it's God, what's it called? Dancing Mind, Thinking Body: A Taoist Way to Exceed, Excel in like sports, business, and personal life. And this was a long time ago, before that stuff was cool. And the entire book it wasn't just a book that you read. It's a small lesson, and then it was either a visualization for multiple hundreds of different situations. Meditation is visualizations, affirmations, and that was the only thing I did differently. And I was older then, I was 29 when I graduated, but when I finally made it through, when I went back to BUD/S, and then understanding that it's like the end of a football season. Everybody's injured when they finish BUD/S. It's just those ones like tears or breaks. It's all the nagging stuff that still really sucks, especially when you're having to perform and put out, that you just have to do it. And my mental toughness, that's what I didn't have before. And the good thing is you can train that stuff, and that's what I did. And that was the big difference. And ironically, I graduated with the same injuries. And plus, I had 2 stress fractures, some bad ITB tendinitis, and I had a tear in my quad. And it was hard to walk, those last few weeks, but I made it through.
So you think it was just the mental? If you're injured, you're injured. How is mental toughness factor? I can say that would keep you from maybe reporting the injury, but you're still injured though, right?
You are, but it's pain. It's not something. It is mental toughness. It's something that's perceived in your head. As if it's not something debilitating that requires ironically, I tore my meniscus in some follow-on training a year later or 6 months later. It was called SEAL tactical training. It's kind of the intermediate phase before you get to a SEAL team, and that was, I think, 6 months as well. But I tore my meniscus right before I went through that training, and it took me those 10 years to make it through. I sure as hell wasn't going to not make it through SEAL tactical training. And it's called SQT now, SEAL qualification training. It's where the guys get their awarded their tridents. They've changed the names. But I went through the entire thing on a torn meniscus that required surgery. So, and it
seems like something that only a Navy SEAL would say.
Well, it's
the torn meniscus. It's all mental.
Here's what I figured out about BUD/S. people have to make it through buds, you have to have a baseline level of resiliency, physiological resiliency and mental toughness just to graduate training.
Just to even show up, I would imagine.
Well, I would say it's like that. There's a lot more screening involved than when I went through, and you have to excel. But still, it's a lot of the top athletes. I mean, we had Olympic caliber athletes and pro athletes that went through, and sometimes they were the first to quit, because they got some little nagging pain. It's those wrestlers and those farm kids that came off farms, and people that endured pain, and they kind of had a different relationship with pain. They could just endure it a lot more.
Did you train to go through before you entered into the SEAL training? Did you train to start it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, yeah. I was in pretty damn good shape back then. I'm old now, so it's a little different now. But I mean, I was running really, really fast, and it was one of the top swimmers in the class, and you could do a lot of pull-ups, about 35 pull-ups, and 120, 130 push-ups at a crack, and it takes that too. I'll tell you what, it makes buds more bearable if you're not always getting your ass kicked by the instructors for falling behind on stuff, because they'll give you special attention after maybe a conditioning run or a timed run. The people who are kind of at the back of the pack, they get the extra attention. That's not fun.
I think that most people probably are hearing what you're saying, and it's completely unrelatable to them. Then there's a good contingency of people who, maybe, I've pushed through some pain in my life, but nowhere near the amount of pain that it would require to complete buds with a torn meniscus, right? I didn't work out this past week because my knee kind of hurt a little bit. That's me,
a smart thing,
right?
To do. And that's the smart thing.
And I think that's most people. Most people don't even have the opportunity to test themselves in that way, right? Forget the fact that most people probably aren't mentally able to withstand that at all. But most people don't even have the opportunity, so they're never challenged and never fail that challenge to recognize,
they don't know if they're mentally tough enough or not,
right?
Yeah.
But it sounds like what you're saying is to get to that place where you've achieved the mental toughness necessary to really perform at an elite level for an extended duration of time, you have to make a decision at every moment to not trust what your brain is telling you about limiting your own potential. How do you arrive at that point?
Well, again, for the most part, just to get in the door, you've had to have some extensive training. You have to be pretty physically fit, and which means that you're continually pushing yourself. So that's a good start. But there's also people come into these things with varying degrees of, like I said, this baseline resilience, physiological resilience that allows you to have that mental toughness, to kind of persevere when it really sucks, because they've already kind of conditioned themselves to it. Aside from, just a lot of people probably think buds is physical, but most people will tell you that 90% of it is mental. It is that pushing through. Because running, if you're running and you get that long burn, or you're pushing yourself, you're kind of used to that, and you can push yourself further and further. But then you start adding things like cold water, an injury, sand that's rubbing on you, people yelling at you, and some pretty bad dudes, getting after you. But it's funny because at the beginning of buds, at least for me personally, I think most people, you can feel kind of the character of the class. We were kind of scared sheep, around the instructors. We kind of didn't know what to expect, and by the end of buds, and I think they loved this. 6 months later, I remember being out at San Clemente Island. The instructors were trying to, I think we were getting surf tortured in the water. We were flipping them off and yelling at them, and the instructors secretly loved it because we're like, you can't hurt us. And you get to that point, so you have that baseline, but then you have 6 months of just forging yourself, and it's pretty impressive how I felt. Mentally and physically, I was kind of beat up, but just overall, just the confidence.
Yeah. So some of that resilience, I'm guessing, is gained or earned during the experience of buds, right? You're going through this miserable experience, and you kind of build up that toughness there, or you don't, and then you leave.
Yep.
What is it that separates the people who? What is it about their life that's different? The people who show up with that requisite level of resiliency and those who don't?
Well, Buds has had such a high attrition rate. I think it's about 28% make it through, about 70 or 82, 78, I can't remember, but it's around 25 or 30% of the people that make it through, that start training, make it through training. Okay. So that's pretty high, and it's pretty costly training. So Naval Special Warfare, for probably 30 or 40 years, they have done every bit of research to try to figure out what kind of person makes it through there so we can target them and recruit them to come in. I think the last time I checked this, my information's a few years old, but wrestlers and water polo people, guys, they seem to have a higher success rate than most people. I also think, I think the way they broke it down, so the officers and enlisted people go through, so like colonels and stuff like that, or, like your gunnery sergeants, but we have, petty officers
Sure.
and ensigns and stuff. They go through it, all of us go through it together. The statistics, again, they're dated, but about 92% of the officers that came from the Naval Academy made it through training. I think it was like 81 or 82% that came from like an NROTC program or an ROTC. They made it. And then OCS, where guys went off and did stuff in college, and just joined and went right through, but they didn't have any military training. It was about 70%, but overall it's about 30%. And I don't think the education necessarily plays that part in it, but I do think that level of commitment to a program where you can see it incrementally, there's more involved. I think that may have something to do with it.
They had more time to of that like looming destination just weighing over their shoulder.
Yeah, but like at the Naval Academy, they still play all the games, and they do physical stuff.
Yeah.
So they had a little bit of exposure to some of that.
That's so interesting. Yeah, because wrestlers make sense, right? I mean, you say, okay, hey, people who do tough things can do other tough things, and wrestling is tough. Wrestling is like the hardest sport that you could choose to pursue. As far as mental toughness, much less physical toughness. I mean,
it's 90% that discomfort. That discomfort is what builds that mental toughness. Intentional.
Yeah,
discomfort.
even when you're winning in wrestling, it hurts.
Yeah.
Even when you're beating someone, it's uncomfortable.
How long did you wrestle?
I trained jiu-jitsu for all close to 6 years. So I've done some wrestling training in my grappling training, and it's the worst part of it. I hate it. I'm not good at it. But I know that if I ever want to get, decent at jiu-jitsu, I got to be able to wrestle. And I hated the idea of spending my days training to defend myself, but not knowing what to do, not understanding how to take someone to the ground, right?
Yeah, but you understand it can't be physical, but you're constantly getting you're getting your face ground against the mat or whatever, that your arm bar or whatever. That's just that pain that the level that you're going to have to keep going.
I trained in college at this gym that was owned and ran by a guy who was a wrestler before anything else. So he had a wrestling background. We'd go to jiu-jitsu class, and it was a little different than other classes where he'd teach us a double leg, and then he'd teach us the arm bar, right? Instead of teaching us to pull guard and drop to our back. A lot of pure jiu-jitsu guys are mostly focused on a much more defensive interpretation of the art, right? Gotcha. And I think that's really where jiu-jitsu came from, whereas wrestling is, sure, there's wrestling defense, but wrestling at its core is very offensive. And as soon as we started to do that wrestling training, I was like, oh man, I'm terrible at this. Mentally and physically, I hated it, and I wasn't good at it. And so it's a stretch to say that I'm a wrestler, but I tried to incorporate that into my practice and say, okay, well, if I'm going to train 4 or 5 days this week, one of those has to be wrestling. And now I can double leg a 12-year-old girl pretty consistently. That's my level of wrestling.
Yeah.
But the idea that wrestlers would excel in this at higher rates makes sense. Officers that's not immediately obvious to me. I would have thought that it would be the opposite.
Well, yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily that they're officers. I think it's that they've been exposed to a 4-year military academy that probably has some similar language and some super early mornings and late nights and constant kind of a regiment, so to speak. That I don't know, and they have that as a motivator too. I mean, that's a long amount of time, and to be an officer, or to get that, and then to get to SEAL training. But they go through like courses like mini buds, and they prep for it. They have clubs like SEAL clubs at the academy, so they're getting exposed to stuff what they know about. And there's a SEAL, actually, a buddy of mine was there a couple of years ago as a liaison, and he ran the guys who wanted to be SEALs. So they were kind of already getting that experience, so it wasn't as much of a shock for them. Is what I think.
Yeah, to get humiliated and belittled by someone who's supposed to be training you wasn't foreign to them.
Yeah, I mean, that stuff after a few days or a couple of weeks, that just kind of becomes white noise. That's kind of what they're training you to do too, without shooting guns around you,
I had read and I don't remember where I read this. There was a recounting of somebody who'd gone through the training, and they said that just what you just said, Rick, is that a lot of the yelling and aggressiveness and all of that became white noise after a while. And this guy who almost quit, one of the instructors took the complete opposite approach. Mm-hmm. And it was just like super sweet to him, super nice to him. Say, man, I know you're hurt, and it's probably be better. And, I hate to see it. But, I was just trying to talk him into it in the sweetest, most loving, caring way.
That stuff works.
And he snapped. He goes, oh, this guy is he's messing with me.
Yep. The guys get pretty smart and innovative.
Yeah. So it took, there was 10-year period going through that. Where did you go after you finished up the SEAL training?
So I spent, the 6 months at Buds, and then I went off to a dive medicine school for a couple of weeks. I was a medic. And then I went through Army Airborne School in Fort Benning, Georgia. That was about a month long. And then checked into my SEAL team at SEAL Team 1, which is in San Diego. And Fort Bragg for the medical training. But and then once I checked into SEAL Team 1, I went through that SEAL tactical training, which is again another 5 months long, 4 or 5 months. And it's again SEAL training, Buds. I wouldn't say it's really training you. I think it's assessing you. I think it's like an HR department for the Navy. It's selecting the guys that they think that are going to have that mental toughness and the physical ability and smarts to do the job of a SEAL, and just to really suck it up, because they told us that being in combat and when you get into the SEAL teams, it's not any easier than Buds, and they were sure right. So you have to prepare yourself, and you have to build yourself up to that level. And so anyways, I went through SEAL tactical training, and then did a few platoons at SEAL Team 1, which means the way a kind of a cycle is you form up with your group of about 15 or 20 guys. It's called a platoon. And you have 6 months of what's called professional development. So if I have a certain skill, like want to be a breacher that does demolition, or become a sniper, then they send guys based on the needs of that platoon through these individual schools, and that's leadership schools as well. And after that first 6 months of professional development, you have what's called unit level training, and that's where you and your platoon and a sister platoon, you spend 6 months going to all these different training places, or pretty much around the West Coast or around the country, but anywhere from things from land warfare to diving to SWAT type stuff called CQB or CQC, close quarters combat. And you just you're honing in your own team, so to speak, like a football team running plays. And then after that year, you have what's called Squadron Integration training, or SIT. Before you deploy. And what that is where you bring in all of the other elements. So like the SEAL team, okay, you have a SEAL platoon. Well, we need intelligence people. We need, aircraft. We need boats. We need explosive ordnance stuff. So it's a constant group of bringing all of them together for 6 months and honing their skills and communications and, the requirements that you need to do. And then you deploy for generally around 6 months. And that's where you're doing the job for 6 months straight. Still training, always training. But
well, one of the things that we want to do on the podcast is to really pull wisdom from people who have different experiences and look at how do we use that wisdom to inform improved decision making, and really just defeat bad decision making. Yeah. So it's interesting because all of the training that you're talking about going through are around sort of forming up a mechanism to essentially, I would think, create rules that are governing future behavior, really taking out the uncertainty of the decision-making process. In fact, sort of trying to remove the decision-making process. But it would seem, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, it would seem that once you're deployed, those situations are so highly charged, so different, so in some cases chaotic, that it would be very difficult to actually create rules around decision making. And so that's where my interest lies, is how do you form up a group that is as successful as the SEALs to make this, to actually try and remove decision making, and then have people who have to make these life and death literally decisions all the time.
Yeah, so it's again, it's the training, and you're preparing for every possible contingency, every possible outcome, but you develop what are called standard operating procedures. And the good thing about the SEAL teams is they allow everyone to be a leader, to everyone to think. Like I'll give you an example during the SWAT type training or the CQB, when you're going through a building and you've got a stack of guys, 10, 15, 20 people. They all know what to do when they encounter whatever the problem is, that's coming up. And some guys have to pull off into a room, and that may have been the top leader in the platoon. Well, the next guy already knows and has to stand up and knows those standard operating procedures. And I think that's a huge part of it, is to minimize all of those possibilities. But, and the SEAL teams are great because they kind of have you don't have to be sick to get better. We're always trying to question, always trying, we're learning stuff. We're also trying to question, okay, why are we doing this? Is this outdated? Is there new stuff that plays into this? So I think, again, it tactically with decision making, there's a lot of things. I mean, with leadership, if guys are asking you about career advice or, how to lead somebody, so to speak, or what should they do in a situation. Well, the good thing is you allow these people to be able to speak, and to kind of come to these conclusions and kind of check them. It's and also to take other people's ideas into consideration. Beforehand. Obviously, when you get into a combat situation, it's kind of you're on kind of fire and forget. And SEALs are really good. I'll tell you one thing that Sanger, I think you're asking me about what separates some guys. I think the ability to compartmentalize and disassociate in chunk. So like with, like learning new skills, like a guitar, you don't just sit down and play the entire song. You have to chunk pieces of that and different things. Well, in SEAL training, in BUDS, it sucks so bad. It's like, oh my God, I just need to get through this run. This run is the only thing I need to worry about. And then after that, the same thing. Well, we do that also in combat. We've got these points of where we're going, and we know these phase lines, and we know that we just need to do our job. We know what to do in that little moment. We don't think of the overwhelming aspect of what's going on around us in combat. It's just, I know what to do right now and what's right in front of me. And once I get to that next point, I'll be there. So I think that chunk.
Yeah, and I think that goes into broadly speaking, a decision-making process that sticks with you for life, I would imagine. Whether it's resiliency or being able to compartmentalize. I think where you were going, it seems like there are, obviously you can't just put a group of 6 guys out there in the middle of the desert somewhere and expect them to make the right decision at every turn, right? You've got to prepare and train with these standard operating procedures, make sure that they know tactically exactly what to do. But then the gray area has to also be trained, right? That resiliency has to be, that's a decision. There's a decision to quit in training, just like there is in combat or in anything else in life that's hard. You have a decision to quit. And the SEALs, it seems like, have done a better job than any organization that I can think of training that out of people or finding people that never had it in the first place.
Yep.
But how much of that is conscious? How much of that resiliency are you guys consciously training outside of the official training times and officially at BUDS? And how much of that compartmentalization, that way of thinking, how much of that are you guys consciously focusing on, maybe when you're not wearing the uniform?
Well, before, I don't think in the SEAL teams there has been some mental training that we have done. some visualization, some type of breath work and meditation type stuff, and that's been more recent. And so that's kind of that's, if I have a passion, it's for how to develop resilience and keep on with mental toughness. And I don't think it was a conscious thing ever for me, other than before my third time at Buds. But once I got into the SEAL teams, wars happened. I mean, that was right before September 11th, and I did multiple combat deployments. I had the loss of 18 close friends that were like roommates and groomsmen in the SEAL teams, that died either in combat training or 5 of them by suicide. And that'll your level of, for me, my level of resilience I thought was pretty good, but traumatic brain injury, SEALs were exposed to so many explosives that they didn't know this until recently, that repetitive blasts cause traumatic brain injuries. It's not like in football where somebody gets hit and they get one part of their brain bruised, right, from the counter-coup effect.
Yeah.
And that part is affected, whatever part of the region of the brain that is. With explosives, right, even small ones, not like the breaching that we do to knock down doors, so to speak. I've been exposed to about 400 or 500 explosive blasts in my life, and they didn't find out until a lot of SEALs were killing themselves. And so they did autopsies on their brains, and their family members donated their brains, and they found out that they had this thing called this tearing through every region of the brain that caused this thing called astroglial scarring. And it's so, after about 10 years, I remember it. So it took me 10 years. A couple buddies of mine made it through SEAL training, so they were 10 years ahead of me. But I remember going, man, they just seem kind of hollow, and I didn't know what it was. I was just like, they're just, turning into kind of jerks and quiet. But it wasn't until the end of my career, all these explosive blasts, right, as well as the loss. And, I've seen some bad stuff. I worked in the medical field and all that stuff. SEALs have to remind themselves every once in a while that they're human, because sometimes they think that our physiology is completely different than everybody else's. The resilience is, I think my resilience was higher, but that's a lot to ask. And so I remember, this is probably about 2014. I remember telling a guy I worked with, I was like, man, I feel like a shell of a man right now. I don't know what it is. I was having sleep issues, and I got put on hormones and, thyroid and testosterone and a bunch of other stuff. And I remember when I was getting ready to retire, and this was a few years, I retired about 2.5 years ago. So it was probably 3.5 years ago. I was doing all my medical appointments and get ready for my VA stuff and disability exams and all that stuff. And traumatic brain injury, most SEALs will tell you, yeah, traumatic brain injury, that's cool, explosives. But when you start talking about PTSD, they're like, nah, that's mental illness, that's mental weakness. That's kind of, it has been, and probably most guys, when they're in, would kind of tell you that. And I had a decision to make, I did. And coming into the kind of the plot of the show, so to speak, I remember I was doing all of these different things for balance. I was doing memory. I was going through speech therapists for memory techniques, and my eyes would bounce as I would walk. So I was doing this vestibular therapy, and I'd lose balance when I was walking in crowded situations. And I remember when I was still in the Navy, but I was applying for my VA appointments for traumatic brain injury. The psychologist asked me, she's like, why aren't you applying for PTSD? I was like, I don't know. I don't think I have it. She's like, oh, you absolutely have it. And that was a big decision for me at that point. It's kind of that was a big catalyst, but I was like, okay, I got to address this. And so when I went back, and talked to my wife and my daughter, I found out that they'd been walking on eggshells around me for the past 4 or 5 years. I reached out to some friends that have known me for a long time that I interacted with regularly. One of my close friends used to have, my brother's living with me at the time, but my friend John used to have to get a hold of my brother to get a hold of me. And that's just one example. So I was kind of starting to isolate myself. And when I realized I was having this generational impact on my daughter, that my behaviors were affecting her, that I'm like, okay, I decided I've got to do something about this. And I did everything I could in the military. I was, they put me on antidepressants and stimulants, and I went to counseling, and it didn't do a thing. I think it screwed me up more than anything. And so you kind of hear guys talking about stuff, through the rumor mills. And I found out about the first thing I tried was this is called it's commonly referred to as transcranial magnetic stimulation. So they put a magnet on your head, and they create these new neural pathways. And you do it over about 6 weeks, about 30 minutes a day. and it helped. It did. It helped my sleep and my mood, but it kind of wore off after a couple months. And I can get to why I think that is that way here in a minute, but it wasn't until I was trying stuff. I started to try to meditate, and I was, that was a big thing. I was reading everything I could. I was proactively engaged in my own help, so to speak. And it wasn't until I heard about a treatment down in Mexico that I was a little skeptical of, but I started doing the research, and it's overwhelmingly supportive. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of psychedelic assisted therapy, Sanger. I'd be surprised if you haven't, because it seems like everybody under 30 knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I'm a little bit familiar. This is like microdosing on psilocybin or no? Okay.
No, definitely not. So so what this is again, went through an entire screening process, went through medical cardiology tests and labs and everything else, and was screened by a psychologist, and went down to Mexico, and it is super, super high doses. Sean, when you and I grew up, kids were probably taking like a gram or two of mushrooms if they ever did that type of stuff. I never did any of that, but so this is like, it would be like 5 grams, but it wasn't mushrooms. It was these 2 drugs. One is called Ibogaine, and it's considered the godfather of psychedelics. It's an old African drug from this tribe out there, the Ibwitis, and they use it for kind of a ritual as they grow up. But the interesting thing about Ibogaine is they found out that it really has a 90% success rate of curing opiate and heroin addiction. That's huge. Okay. Well, they found out of curing it, of being
curing the addiction,
physiologically free, doing blood tests and whatever else they do for that. Literally, there's zero withdrawal. You do this, and it's about 12 hours of, feels like you're getting hit with a baseball bat. It's pretty hardcore, and it scares off a lot of SEALs because it's the medicine is one thing, okay, and that's a huge thing, but it's the insights you gain that are almost like from
so I have a question about that. So if you look at the repeated explosive blasts are changing the physiology of the brain, and I would think that there's some scarring, how is this Ibogaine correcting, or is it rewiring connections in the brain to overcome that distress?
Yep, it's one of the only things that they know of that can heal existing injury, but it also reroutes it. They've done functional MRI studies on it, and you'll see a normal brain. They'll look at it and it'll be like some lines here and there, but when they show it on psychedelics, it's the entire brain is getting rerouted and reconnected and healing. There's so much. Johns Hopkins has been doing studies on this, and a lot of other people. Heck, Johns Hopkins, it's not some fringe thing. They just opened up a $19 million psychedelic research center on their main campus a few years ago. And
so when did you do this?
This was in 2019. And
have you experienced any downsides to it that you observed?
Yeah, the other one I didn't tell you about is called 5-MeO DMT, and its nickname is the God molecule. If you've ever seen Mike Tyson recently, he seems like a much nicer person. Well, that's because he did 5-MeO DMT. Tony Robbins did it too recently, last year or two, and about 350 SEALs. But the only downside is after the 5-MeO DMT experience, you will not shut the hell up. You'll want to tell everybody on the planet about it. So that's the only side effect, because it's so amazing. And I'll explain, if you don't mind, I'll explain to you why it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's a lot to unpack, in a short amount of time. But I think if you'll hear what I'm saying, and if you spend 10 minutes with studies or the internet or talking to people, really well-educated, smart people, you're going to say this isn't complete hocus pocus voodoo. I went from being a lifelong atheist, okay, and let me backtrack. So Johns Hopkins did a study in 2004 or 5 where they had 80 or 100 terminally ill cancer patients. They were going to die, and they experimented with what's called a heroic dose, that 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms, right? And 80% of those people said this is the single most meaningful experience of their entire life. I think 80% of that 80, I think they said it was in the top 5. But what they found out, and what these psychedelics can do, if administered with the right set and setting, the right environment, the right preparation, you're in the right headspace, so to speak, they can occasion what's called a mystical experience. And psychologists and psychiatrists have, in their manuals a rating scale of what actually criteria has to be met for it to be a mystical experience. And when I say mystical, I'm saying a real live, no shit, spiritual experience. You can coin it whatever you want. You can coin it God, you can coin it mysticism, but it is spiritual. And it's 15 minutes long. The Ibogaine is like 12 hours, and the next day you do the 5 Emo Dmt. 15 minutes, I walked out of there going, I just experienced God. And it was so much more real than reality. And what's ironic, or what's interesting, psychologists have talked about this, that people who have these mystical experiences, they will put it up there against anything reality that there is. And I'll even go you one further. In 2020, there's a guy named Brian Marescu who wrote a book called The Immortality Key. It's a best-selling book, and it's if you haven't read it, you should. He did his undergrad at Brown, went to Georgetown Law, grew up, he wanted to be a priest, but then realized he probably needed to make a little money, right? And so he became a lawyer. But he had a near-death experience as a kid. He wanted to be a priest, and then he read about these Johns Hopkins accounts, those 3 things. And he knew scripture really well, but he said all 3 of these things, they're almost identical. They are identical. He said, there's got to be something more to this. So he took 12 years and to write this book, but the reason it took him so long, there's way more to it than what I'm talking about. Obviously, it's about 400 pages, but kind of the smoking gun, if you will, was it took him a few years, but he got access into 3 pretty interesting places: the catacombs in Rome, which is like 30 or 40 miles of centuries, thousands of years of artifacts and things like that. He also got access into archaeological dig sites around Galilee, which is around where Jesus was at. And he finally, this is huge, he got access into the secret archives of the Vatican, into their old sites, right? And they brought MIT out. There's a new, I'm going to butcher this up, and I always do, but it's some new technology. It's some like gastrospectrometry, archaeobotany type of, where they can do analysis on ancient artifacts, and they can pull out what was in what substances was in this. And so he had 600 holy chalices from these archaeological dig sites, the Roman catacombs, and quite a few from the Vatican. All 600, every single one of them, pop positive for this substance called ergot, which is 10 times stronger than LSD. And so again, when I went through my experience in 2019, I was like, I don't know what to make of this. I knew about the mystical experience, but I was like, I mean, I know it's real. To me, it was real, and I believe it to be real. But I was kind of lost, but it wasn't until I read Brian's book, even though I was an atheist before that, I read his book, and I'm like, okay, this isn't some new fringe thing. It actually talks about the Pagan continuity hypothesis, which was the Dionysians, or the Greeks actually were doing this 2,000 years. And, if you think it's probably about, you guys are up in Dallas area?
Yeah.
Fort Worth. I mean, this whole region.
Fort Worth.
So, I mean, it'd be like Fort Worth, Austin, and Houston, that whole region where all this history is coming from. It's you just got to put things in the time. And again, I don't have a perspective, so I'm trying not to offend anybody, any listeners or anything about this, or being a heretic, so to speak. But it's a small area, and if you think about when the Roman emperors and all that stuff were around, I mean,
I don't think it doesn't. In my belief, it doesn't take away any of the truth of those beliefs if it so happened that they were influenced by these substances. So to take it with 100% face value and say that, yes, that's a fact, they were influenced by these substances, how does that make it any less real or any less true to interpret the scripture in the way that we've been interpreting it? It doesn't.
Well, it doesn't. You're right. But if you talk to somebody who says, well, the earth is only 3,000 years old based on scripture, and they won't budge from that position, well, then I wouldn't bring this position up to them either.
Well, yeah.
So, I mean, I've heard that, that there was that chemical in the wine back then. And, I couldn't help but think that may be that if that's how they made wine. I don't know if we know if that was added.
It was added.
Or if that was, that it was always added.
Yep.
Or it was added in those specific vessels. And that may be why there is this sort of universal across all religions, this prohibition or control on that substance.
Brian talks about that in his book.
A lot of the religions, speak to drinking wine. They all do. Right?
It was around
and it may be that it is this gateway to, another realm that is, as you said, is as real as anything else, right?
More so.
Who's to say your experience wasn't real?
Yep. I mean, it's funny. He has a quote in the book, and it's a lot of people say they believe in God. I'm like, well, cool, that's awesome, man. I feel pretty fortunate. I feel like I got to experience God. And so Brian has a quote in his book that says, I've gotten to meet him in the last 6 months and hung out with him quite a few times. He's an awesome dude. But does it really matter if you've jumped in the ocean? Does it really matter if you believe in water? And that's kind of what a lot of people they have. I mean, just think about it. If this wasn't real, again, it's just people's beliefs. I think a long time ago, there's this experience that people were basing this off of, and then they kind of went out and tried to talk about it. And God dang, when I got back from my experience, some of the guys that I went through were like, this is like a lot of stuff I read in the Bible. Go read about this. Go read about Moses and the burning bush, which I found out the acacia tree or whatever it's called has exorbitant amounts of DMT in it, and which is what the burning. There's like 8 trees in Jordan, and that's one of them. So, but the big thing afterwards, Sean, is if you don't mind, sorry to cut you off, but the big thing was when I got back. Okay, when I got back to my family, and my wife and daughter cried for weeks. They were so happy. My daughter was like, I got my daddy. And my wife was like, I got the husband I married back, and it was pretty amazing. And I've maintained my 4 non-negotiables that I do every day because you want to keep that neuroplasticity alive. The one thing I didn't talk about, the mystical experience, if people don't meet that criteria for a mystical experience, they can have results that can kind of start to wane after a while. Okay. But when people, so
these smaller, if you think about when, people do this recreationally, that they're not getting to that mystical level. They're not getting to this point where you got to.
Correct. And that's why the preparation, the environment you're in, but also they use like a mask. So it's not like you're looking at the pretty lights. It is such an internal, I mean, it's pretty amazing,
So you mentioned that prior to this experience, you were atheist. How did you come out the other side of that? How do you think about things now?
I mean, I'm a believer based on that experience, without a doubt. And
in what?
In God, in that there's.
Well, I mean, okay, so but explore that more. I mean, so you had this experience. You believe that there is a God. Is that where it ends, or have you settled into some structural faith system that supports that, or where did you tell me about that journey after you got back?
So afterwards, until I read Brian's book, I knew it was God, but I thought it was so diametrically opposed to anything that would be church related until I read his book. I thought it was just some hippie stuff, but it was all universal love. It was this being like bathed in your mother's womb, but it was visual, but it was also just it was like somebody loading a shotgun with the secrets of the universe from the beginning of whenever and just blasting it in your head. It's like a river of knowledge just going by, and it's universal too. A pretty common. The unique thing about 5-MeO DMT, where mushrooms, people have different experiences. LSD, they have different experiences. Ayahuasca is called the spirit molecule because they have a spiritual experience, but it's kind of different as well. There's a lot of commonalities in the God molecule that the way people explain it, but the experience is one thing. It's what I came out with afterwards, and it is a belief that we are eternal, 100%, and we've always been eternal, and that everyone gets the big surprise party at the end, so to speak. Again, it wasn't until I met Brian, and ironically, we were on an email together when I met him, and he had mentioned some name. We were on about 6 archdiocese in the Catholic Church, a monk, and a couple other people, and they were talking about this name, and I had to Google it, and they were talking about Pope Francis. So Brian works with Harvard Divinity School a lot now and has for years, but the Pope is really interested in his findings. And so there's a high up member in the Catholic Church that, based on, I believe, the Pope's kind of, hey, let's kind of look into this. I don't know if he chose to do it on his own or whatever it was, but he did 5-MeO DMT, and a 78-year-old archdiocese in the Catholic Church, and I was there to witness it. And he came out of it, and I think his words were, he's like, I can't believe this. It's all true. It is all true. And, it's a real fast-acting medicine. It wears off fast, and he still stands firm to that, and he was at least open enough to look at that, because nobody thinks it's a hallucination who do it. And,
right. Right.
What's interesting to me is that it doesn't.
Go ahead.
A couple of things. One is the idea of what's real, right? For me to understand if this table is real, well, okay, I can touch it, I can see it. But also, if I bring other people into this room, they'll see it and be able to touch it as well. And so it's not just that I can touch it that makes it real. That there are things I cannot touch, right? I can't touch COVID. I guess it's real. There are a lot of things I can't touch and I can't see. I can't touch or see air, but I surely know it's real. But everybody else has an identical experience to me with air as we do with this table. And what's interesting about the DMT experience is that everybody seems to have the exact same experience, or at least a very, 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 very similar experience. The imagery that people use to describe it, the way that they feel afterwards, the duration of it, the long-lasting effects of it, it all seems to be so similar. And so when we talk about whether or not it's real, well, shoot, if it's if it's a shared experience, what else does it need to be real?
Yep. No, I agree. And if at the end of the day, if I die and there's nothing there, it doesn't matter, man. It enhanced my life and the lives of people around me at a level that is immeasurable, and that kind of shared experience. I remember I kept hearing about ineffable, which I didn't know what that meant before I went there, but ineffable, it's undescribable. It's impossible to describe in words. So when people tell about their experiences or do stuff, they're describing the indescribable. And that was the first words when I came out of the experience. I sat up and I went, I now know what the word ineffable means, because there's no way you'd ever be able to do it justice what it is.
It's interesting to think, that you went through that looking for a cure to some damage, physiological damage, and looking for a cure, and kind of found something completely different that brought you to a different reality.
Yep. Give me goosebumps.
So it's that's interesting. So it's interesting that your family noticed the change right away. Has that been a more long lasting change?
Yeah, it's been 2.5 years almost. So it was I think October of 2019. So almost 2.5 years. But again, it's
tell me about the decision to try that, because that's a non-standard approach.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd have to admit that's. I mean, you're having to go to Mexico to do that, right?
Yep.
I think that's what you said. So, did that concern you at all? Just to say, hey, this isn't sort of blessed by modern medicine. This isn't paid for by my insurance. I'm having to go, to a different country. Did that concern you? I know the outcome turned out good for you, but tell me about that decision.
Well, I was at a point where, I was on antidepressants. I was drinking too much. I was on stimulants. I was suicidal. I was suicidal, and I was happy in my misery though, and it wasn't until I had this realization about how much I'm affecting my family, that my daughter is going to be the recipient of my behaviors or irritability or anger or whatever it was, or just me not being a good dad or whatever it was. And I don't know, I had an epiphany moment. I was like, if again, and I did the research and talked to a lot of people in the organization, the nonprofit that I went through. It's called VETS, a retired SEAL named Marcus Capone and his wife Amber, and it's Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions, and they're friggin' amazing people. You can find them all over on podcasts and stuff now. They're working with a lot of big people. But, I talked to Marcus on the phone for quite some time, and then, all the preparation, I never ever once thought about turning back once I did a little bit of the preparation. And that's kind of the SEAL way, is to do that preparation.
What you said stood out to me is that you were happy in your misery. And yeah, I think that's a common experience for a lot of people, even if they don't recognize it. Like I think that we've all had experience in our life or a time period, whether it was brief or prolonged, where we weren't living a life that in any way represented our ideal self. We're not living up to our values. We're not making good decisions. For some people, that's a matter of weeks, and for some people, that's decades. For some people, it's permanent. But what's so dangerous about that moment is that we can stay there because it's comfortable. It's comfortable despite the pain, right? Yep, despite the misery, it is comfortable to just drink all day, sit on the couch and take antidepressants.
Yeah, there's no effort.
As miserable as it sounds.
Well, you know what the rules are. I mean, you know what the outcome is. There's not a lot of, surprises there. It's when that changes that it becomes really challenging. When you're faced with, how do I make new decisions in the face of a new circumstance?
Yeah, right? Some of that comfort is because it's repetitive, but I think also some of that comfort is that it's it prevents us from seeing if we're living a lifestyle like where we're consciously making decisions that are harming ourselves. We're making duller and duller that image of who we could be, and the duller that image becomes, that means the harder it is for us to see. And once we can no longer see who we could become, then we can't feel bad for not becoming that. I can't feel sadness for that loss of who I could be at my best if I refuse to look it in the face.
Yeah, you're right. And then, it's interesting. One of the things I've picked up that was recommended to me during the, when I was going through this whole process, and I told you guys about that book I read before I went through SEAL training, the third time that changed it. And I just didn't do any of that stuff afterwards. But I've since, for the last 2.5 years, picked up a really non-negotiable a morning routine that involves gratitude practice, gratitude, like some sort of practice. I actually do notes and write, and if you've never heard of gratitude, journaling or gratitude practice, I mean, there's this guy, Andrew Huberman, who's a neuroscientist at Stanford. I mean, there's so much research on it and why it works that it is unfreaking believable. The subjective well-being that your life, and also the relationships that you will have with other people by not being cynical, by seeing other people's perspectives, and that's a huge decision. Just that's big in decision making too. If you already have all your preconceived notions in your head and never see other people's alternatives or other people's point of views because you don't have the ability to do that, gratitude practice has changed my life. And I was when I first heard about it, I was like, gratitude journaling? What, are you kidding me? I'm not doing that stupid shit. But then once I started researching, I'm like, this works.
We did that in our office on some meetings that we would lead, that we would have weekly, and I would lead this meeting, and I started having everybody go around and just share with the group what they were thankful for, and it went well the first few times. Then the energy kind of died down on it, and people are like, I don't have anything. Go to the next person. And I stopped. I said, why do you think we're doing this?
Yep.
And went through the exercise of that actually this gratitude, if you find a way to recognize the gratitude that is internal and express that to another person, that there's actually a physiological change in the lowering of the cortisol. And it's a healthy thing to do. Not just relationally, not just for the person that you're expressing that gratitude to, but for your own health.
It's huge. I was just
it's not about making that person feel good.
Well, believe it or not, so I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and I think this came out. It's Andrew Huberman, the neuroscientist, and he's like the gratitude master. But I think it came out in November, and Sean, he's probably referencing the same studies that you did. That gratitude for yourself or what you're grateful for, that's a big deal. However, the emerging research has shown that if you can receive gratitude, so in those meetings, if you were telling, at the next meeting, I want you to come and tell so and so what you have, what you're grateful about them, and then receiving that. I forget, there's the whole neural connections and all that crap, but the subjective well-being of how you feel about yourself it increases your life way more than just what I'm grateful for. So I thought that was a really interesting thing I heard yesterday.
Yeah, to have someone else receive the gratitude that you're giving them. Is that what you're saying?
Well, so like if I was giving, I was like Sanger, man, if I knew you real well and was telling you what I'm grateful for about you, but I am grateful for you guys giving me this opportunity to express these views and to share my story and to hopefully help somebody. And what you're doing is amazing, and that is real. So you guys hearing that receive more benefit than if I was telling myself, oh, I'm grateful for my wife because blah, 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 and this is how she makes me feel. They're both awesome, but the giving gratitude or receiving it from other people has more of an impact, so to speak.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think that it goes a long way to changing how we view other people too, to intentionally express that gratitude. There's this really good book by the Arbinger Institute called The Anatomy of Peace, and one of the concepts they talk about is how we'll put other people in boxes so that we don't have to address their humanity, and we can interact only with them to the extent of our preconceived notions about their motivation, their actions, who they are. And by doing that, we can exist in this perpetual cycle of never addressing each other's humanity, not treating each other like people, and we treat each other as obstacles or as hurdles in our own way to getting what we want for ourselves. And to simply show someone gratitude is, in addition to all of the benefits that you outlined, is acknowledging their humanity and removing my ability to treat them as an object, to treat them as an obstacle, and to minimize them or to place them in a box. It forces themselves, in my head doing that, or in any of our head doing that, and in our hearts, it forces them out of that box.
Yeah, and it's got to be a daily practice, though. It's like going to the gym. You're not going to hit the weights one time at the gym and all of a sudden be, Arnold Schwarzenegger, so to speak. Yeah. So it takes that consistency and a practice, just like meditating. Meditating, you have compounding. It's like compounding interest. It goes like this, at a slow kind of incline for a while, and then it dramatically increases. And I really noticed that with my meditation practice after probably, it's a few months. Just my self-awareness, my thoughts that were on autopilot. Because again, we're efficient human beings. We come up with a neural pathway and a habit or a behavior, and that becomes on autopilot. And it's when we're aware that we're doing that, then we can only start to break that cycle. And that's where like gratitude journaling and meditation can really help people out. And I wish we had some more time to talk about it, but I would absolutely, if you're not, you don't have to be sick to get better. So to speak, and it'll really enhance lives, relationships, work relationships, and the ability to be present for people and actually listen.
I love that.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah. I have so many more books I have to read now after talking to Rick.
Well, if you want to hit me up, Brian Marescu has a 10-minute little an animation that some guy did. I forgot what it's called. I think it's the best kept secret in the world or something in history. The best kept secret in history. And it's on YouTube. It'll give you kind of a synopsis of the book.
Yeah, we'll put a link on that on the show notes, and Morgan's got her work cut out for her with all the books we thrown at her. But hey, Rick, how can people get a hold of you if they want to follow up with you or anything like that?
Well, I mean, we can email me at my company name, which is rick rick.andstrom at Langskip LANGSKIP LLC.com. And interestingly, Langskip is a Viking ship. It's the Norse term for a Viking ship, and they're really innovative, and I thought it was kind of cool and a lot of stuff in history.
Hey, Rick, thanks for your time. Yeah. Thanks for talking with us.
Thank you so much, Rick.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
guys.
I appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. It was great talking with you.
My takeaways are, it's kind of interesting. My first thought is that I was on a journey and I thought we were going one place to talk about action in Afghanistan and Iraq from a Navy SEAL, and we took a left turn that was so fascinating. And so my takeaways are around the gratitude journaling, and the really the need to create a morning habit of that gratitude and meditation. And I think that was something that kind of hit me.
My takeaway is that just like we have to train our physical bodies, we have to train our minds, and that can aid us in the decision-making process, because ideally we'd want to make decisions absent from resentment, absent from stress, free from those negative emotions that can weigh us down. And it's going to be hard to deflect stress, deflect resentment, deflect victimhood at each individual decision. And so that training comes away from decision-making opportunities. It comes in meditation and in gratitude practice and in other areas where we can center ourselves around healthy ideas and beliefs. That way, when decisions present themselves, we're able to make those decisions with less influence from those negative feelings.
Perfect.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Decidedly. I hope you learned something. I know I did. If you thought our show was 5-star worthy, please check us out on iTunes and give us a 5-star review. It really helps out a lot, helps people find our community and defeat bad decision making in their own lives. Check us out at decidedlypodcast.com and on Facebook and Instagram at Decidedly Podcast. Until next time, I'm Sanger Smith with Sean Smith. This is Decidedly.
Insights, advice, and comments provided by Sean Smith, Sanger Smith, and speakers identified as part of the Decidedly podcast should not be considered recommendations. Speakers who are not identified as members of Decidedly are expressing their own opinion, and their statements should not be construed as reflecting the views of the Decidedly team. This podcast is produced solely for informational purposes, not personalized advice.